The Mike Brown murder verdict was finally announced. It took the prosecutor 3 months and 30 minutes to basically say nothing.
Rioting and looting. Is it about protecting property or a reaction to years of black rage?
Every time President Obama talks about Ferguson, he sounds like a white man. What about context? I'm Cleo Monago.
And I'm Anthony Harris, and you're listening to the Parallel Realities Podcast. Greetings and welcome to the Parallel Realities Podcast. I'm Anthony Harris with Cleo Monago. Cleo, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right, man. How are you?
It's real strange how things just happen. I think we all knew that we were going to hear what we heard in terms of the Mike Brown verdict, but still, nonetheless, it hurts.
Yes, it does hurt. But as you said, for me, it was highly predictable, and it's exactly what I expected. So the hurt is not based on shock. It's based on the perpetual, blatant disrespect for black life in the society. And, being black and caring about humanity, it just doesn't feel good.
Now, Prosecutor Bob McCulloch made a rather lengthy announcement. One of the first words he talked about when he made the announcement, he kind of chastised social media for what they were doing in terms of this whole process over 100 days, and he seemed very defensive in terms of when he made his announcement. What did you think of the overall process and his announcement?
Well, it was very predictable. First of all, the whole 30 minutes was basically a contextualization and a justification of what he was going to say. So what he was trying to tell the populace was that, I know you've heard all this stuff. I know you've also heard from witnesses. But the bottom line is that what you heard from the press and what you heard from witnesses is not reliable information. So that's why he had to attack those two sources, because those two sources were known to the public. So he also implied very early in his comments that a lot of hearsay was determining the popular view. So he had to do that. He had to do that so he could prepare listeners to say that there was going to be no indictment for Darren Wilson. It makes sense to me, not that the thing was sensible, but it's a logical method to doing what he wanted to do.
He also eliminated the testimony of several witnesses. Now, he didn't go into detail, didn't list names. At least I didn't hear him listing names of testimony. But just through analysis, you can conclude that one of those were the person that Mike Brown was with that afternoon, Dorian Johnson, who immediately was the first face we had seen, and he had a lot of comments and everything. What did you think of? Again, Dorian Johnson is the only person who was there who was part of the process, other than Darren Wilson, who could speak about it. What did you think of the fact that immediately Dorian Johnson was eliminated as a not credible witness? And clearly, although Bob McCulloch didn't mention this in his statement, his lengthy statement, it was clear that Dorian Johnson was one of the people who could not be considered credible.
Well, let me just add this. The prosecutor was not supportive of really prosecuting or interrogating Wilson. We all know about, particularly through Lisa Bloom's comments, a well-known attorney, that he was coddled. He being Wilson, he was coddled. He was given a lot of time to make his case. He was not cross-examined. So I say that because this whole thing was not a serious intention to get justice. So they had to slice up and discredit everybody that they could. Now, as we know, when McCulloch spoke, he didn't say anything about who he was talking about in particular when he says people were disqualified. Some of us are just assuming it was a young man that was with him, but he knows that we will never know who that is. So what difference does it make?
Right. Well, and as you said, there was no counter. It almost seemed as though the prosecutor, Bob McCulloch, was really playing the role of a defense attorney in this process. And
exactly.
As you said, coddled Darren Wilson. And it seemed as though Darren Wilson had the opportunity to wax poetic about what happened and frame this particular argument or discourse in the way they wanted to do, in the way they wanted, rather. Now, did you find it somewhat interesting, and this is Stereotype 101, did you find it interesting in some of the words that Darren Wilson used? He said Mike Brown behaved like a demon. He was big, and all these words that were used, and it kind of played into so many stereotypes, but it also played into the story that we'd heard all along about what the supposed struggle that took place.
Hey, it speaks for itself, man. I mean, what we just saw again, because we saw it during the Zimmerman trial, and the few other trials that got public display like this. But what we saw was a very white man just justifying the decision that he wanted to make. And he was biased from the very beginning, and he had no intention of being a prosecutor. He was a defender of Darren Wilson. In order for that to work, he had to do all this discrediting, including social media, including witnesses, everybody.
Right. Now, one of the more interesting things that also was revealed that during the whole process, and you hear this talk about forensics, and that's what everyone who's in favor of the verdict by the grand jury, they talk about the forensics does not lie. But thanks to the work, and you mentioned Lisa Bloom, and she's been on point. But who's also been on point is CNN's Sunny Hostin. She's a former lawyer, and she's been talking about this as well. And one of the things she talks about that is key. Remember, the day Mike Brown was shot, the body was there for 4 hours. And we're hearing about the importance of forensics. But she mentions that, and again, this is in the grand jury testimony because one of the medical examiners was interviewed. And again, taking pictures of a crime scene is very important. You may remember the O.J. Simpson case where that's very important to know where things were, what happened, how far it was from this, and blah, blah, blah. So Sunny Hostin made it really clear in doing some interviews when other people kind of ignored it. The medical examiner that day could not take pictures of the crime scene because he had no batteries. Now, I'm kind of bothered by the fact that that's not really made important here. It's not really shed to light. It's just part of the, oh, well, there's more forensics, there's a blood drip here and things like that. And Lisa Bloom's been pointing out how it's almost incredible that Mike Brown was shot, moved this way, turned back around, did all these things. And it's like, and it's almost like, we talk about parallel realities here. There's another reality going on that people, number one, couldn't consider that, okay, we need to take this to trial so the jury can weigh all the evidence.
Well, I think in 4 hours, somebody can get some batteries if they want some. It don't take that long to go get some batteries. I mean, this event did not happen in the hillside or way out in the country. It happened in the middle of a city. So they didn't want no batteries. They didn't want to do proper interrogation of this situation because as we know from being there, there's a white power structure that has enjoyed its power and its ability to reign supreme and control the black masses. And they have no interest in changing that. And so why would they want to humanize and properly interrogate a crime scene with a young black man who was murdered, especially when it was a white guy did it, and they could legally turn the tables on the whole history of how that place has operated. So that he wasn't interested in no batteries.
Here's one thing I'd also like to explore with you in the last couple of minutes we have in this segment. Now, the incident that happened at the store where Mike Brown roughed up the store clerk, that plays into that whole narrative where Darren Wilson talks about he behaved like a demon. Now, just for the purposes of discussion, this is a conversation you and I have had before, but in terms of the frustration and the anger that black men, or really black people, but in these cases, black men feel when they are constantly harassed and bothered by the police or made to feel as if they are insignificant. So based on what we saw on the store video when Mike Brown roughed up the store clerk, then being bothered by a police officer, maybe for the umpteenth time, asking him to get out the street, and the response and that whole energy. Can you just, because I think this is a very important conversation that you and I have had. Can you just talk to me a bit about that kind of rage that black men may hold in, and sometimes it just comes out?
Well, when it comes to this scenario surrounding Mike Brown and his murder, All I can do is hypothesize, but amidst that hypothesis, though, is some facts that you just laid out in terms of the kind of experience black men live with, looking over their shoulders, being considered a criminal or being criminalized. My take on Michael Brown, if indeed that's him on the video, and apparently it is, I think that Michael Brown, like a lot of men that we met in Ferguson, was frustrated. And as opposed to just looking at him as a bully, I think he was frustrated, probably was even frustrated by the merchants who are not black and having to deal with glass all the time. You know, dealing with people from behind glass. That whether it's conscious or unconscious, that's assaulting to us. When we have to see this glass and be treated like we're dangerous all the time. And I believe even with Trayvon, that part of the reaction, and I relate to this reaction, which is why this is my subjective perspective. But part of the reaction to this whole thing is, look, I'm effing tired of the treatment, the environment, always having to be seen as a criminal. And I think many a black man in this country has died when they finally couldn't take it no more and said, you know, F this. And I think that's probably what happened to Michael. And also, ironically, people like Darren Wilson and other white folks, because they felt threatened, because they know they're wrong and they know somebody should get them because of what they've done historically, they have hypersensitivity in the presence of a black man who's not complying, because I think they have paranoid fantasies about black reprisal and black people doing retribution. So they kill to make sure that doesn't happen. So there's stuff going on both sides that are bigger than what's happening materially in front of us.
Right. Not to think that this is a new phenomenon, killing unarmed black men getting killed by the police. No, this is not new. But in terms of the training nowadays, it just seems like a lot of cops are fearful, are just very afraid. And we've had a number of incidents. We know about the shooting in the staircase in New York where the cop just shot. And even the police commissioner admitted it was a mistake. There's a fear. There's a fear from the police, and there seems to be no training. So I'm just trying to understand, okay, you just presented one side. Is the fear legitimate on the police officer's case when they are out here in the streets trying to protect and serve?
Man, look, I just had flashbacks while you were talking. I used to wear a cop's uniform and work as a cop. So my perspective in response to that question is not theoretical. When I worked in the East Los Angeles Sheriff Department, the white men who made up most of the deputy sheriffs, they weren't simply afraid, they were vindictive. And they had these ideas around masculinity and control and envy when it came to black men. And they were acting out some stuff. They were acting out feeling in fear to black men when it came to sports or physical size or bravado. They were acting out feelings of being racist. I mean, there's facts. There's documentation that there are Klan members in Florida on the police department. And this kind of white supremacist, white vindictive behavior has been a part of police culture for ages. So I don't think the so-called fear is brand new at all. I think what's brand new is smartphones. That's what's going on here. I mean, if it wasn't for smartphones, we wouldn't have seen Michael Brown's body. We wouldn't have seen Trayvon's body. We wouldn't have heard about these kinds of things. What's going on here is people are taking pictures, and there's audio, and there's some level of evidence. I mean, that's what happened with Rodney King. I'm from LA. I am extremely clear and precisionally informed about LA. And if it wasn't for a fact that somebody saw him getting beat on video, that situation would have never been known about, and it would not have changed. What happened to Rodney King was a normal part of the backdrop of Los Angeles life for black men.
Right. Rodney King was really the very first video, and you may recall there was a not guilty verdict there as well. Interesting, the book by former police chief Norm Stamper. The book is called Breaking Rank, and he kind of talks a great deal about what you just talked about. And his book came out, I believe, in the 90s, if I'm correct. But the name of the book is Breaking Rank. The author is Norm Stamper, former police chief in Seattle. He also worked in Los Angeles. He talks about how white cops will go after black men. And just as you talked about there. That's the first segment. We'll get into a few other things in just a moment. You're listening to the Parallel Realities Podcast. Anthony Harris with Cleo Monago. You're listening to the Parallel Realities Podcast. Protests all over the country in reaction to the Mike Brown verdict, not guilty for Darren Wilson. And there's been protests all over the country, spearheaded by what happened in Ferguson from the moment Mike Brown was killed. Now, as a result of the grand jury verdict, there was some rioting and looting, but was that really a result of when the verdict came down, 9 p.m. in the evening, or was it just people being angry? What are your thoughts, Cleo?
Clearly, the reaction that occurred last night throughout the country, particularly in Ferguson where fires started, was reaction to the verdict. And to be specific, in my opinion, it was reaction to the blatant disregard for black life and another white man getting away with murder. And since they couldn't control the process, I think the people call themselves controlling their material reality and decided to make a statement. And they clearly made one.
Right, but the fact that it was announced at 9 p.m., so late at night. Now, in the previous cases of protests throughout this 109-day ordeal, during the day there were peaceful protests. No major Molotov cocktails being thrown and all that crazy stuff. In the evening, that was when things went off. In fact, one young man was killed in the evening in October. So now for the prosecutor and the state to have this announced in the evening, do you think there was something underhanded there?
Well, I don't know if the word underhanded is the whole thing is underhanded. The prosecutor was underhanded. I mean, him giving it over just to show some type of activity that looked legitimate that he handed over to the grand jury was underhanded. So the whole thing is underhanded. But I think everything they did was strategic. I think it took them 3 months to say what they said because they had to really, really, really be strategic. So everything they did was strategic, and I'm not sure they got what they wanted. But one anchor person on TV said that, and I think they might be right, that they probably did it at night because during the day there might be more people out, and the later they did it, the fewer people were out, and they might have a smaller reaction. As a matter of fact, the white commentators kept saying over and over again how small the crowd was.
Okay. Well, there are no small crowds in these protests that are taking effect across the nation. Highways being shut down in LA, New York, Boston, and things like that, and obviously what's happening in Ferguson. Much of it led by young people. What are your thoughts on that? And do you think it's frustration over racism, or is it something else?
Well, I think that it's frustration over what they see as injustice. They saw, from their perspective, a young black male who was unarmed be murdered and his body laid in the street. And I think that was symbolically powerful. Then we have these other cases across the country. The guys now, including a 12-year-old kid in New York. We have all the people that in LA and Chicago. Every city that stayed focused on this has local incidences. So I think that they're frustrated with police brutality. I'm not sure they're frustrated with racism, though, because a lot of young people these days have bought into the concept of being in a post-racial era, and preceding that post-racial era myth, there has not been a lot of black unity or black collective focus on resolving this issue. So I think they're feeling disappointed by their black guardians. For example, when Jesse Jackson went to Ferguson, and when others went to Ferguson, particularly ministers, they got booed off the stage and they told them to get the hell out.
Al Sharpton.
And these people were black.
Yeah, Al Sharpton too, for the most part. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, they
Go
allowed.
on.
They allowed Al Sharpton to preach at the service, which he did a great job. But in terms of leading the protests or the face of the protests, he's not really been there.
Right. So between a older generation that has not it just has been so involved in assimilation and bling bling, or looking like we have bling bling, and been more caught up with keeping up with the Joneses than learning our history and the context of our lives as it relates to politics and injustice. These young people don't have that. They don't have that information. So they're tired of the black folks, and they're tired of what appears to be white cops, but they don't. I don't think many of them see the white supremacist pattern here.
Well, I mean, so are you? I mean, are you chastising them, or I mean,
I'm just describing them. I mean, I can't chastise them for something that's not their fault. It's not their fault they don't know their history. Their parents are the ones who didn't tell them their history.
Well, how does that
Because their
affect?
parents didn't know their history.
Right. How does that affect this movement? Because now they are the leaders of this movement, and they can kind of take it wherever it can go, as being in the forefront of it. How does that affect this movement with them not really? I mean, because I think we'll both agree that this is about racism, if you look at it. So, and you're suggesting that some of them may have, because of parents or whatever, may have bought into the post-racial myth. So as a result, where will the movement go as a result of this lack of clarity?
I don't know where it's going to go. I mean, I was on the freeways in Los Angeles blocking traffic in reaction to Zimmerman being let off. And Zimmerman is still let off, and he's somewhere chilling. So my point is that this frustration, and also, I'll back up a little bit, there were protests about Trayvon in every major city, but nothing changed. The system, I mean, we have the bodies of black males are still piling up. And as I said to you in one-on-one conversations, as somebody who travels throughout the country and goes to different states, there's local stories of black male bodies in most major cities and even minor cities. So, as I've said before, our young people are not making this a black human rights issue. So I don't know where it's going to go. I do know that until it's a black human rights issue, and until it's a counter white supremacy issue, and until it's an issue of permanently addressing injustice in terms of a permanent solution, and or making it politically dangerous to mess with black folks, until that happens, ain't nothing gonna change. Because it's easy for a cop to kill a black person and justify it. It's extremely easy. If I'm driving down the street, matter of fact, I don't know if you saw it or not, but I sent it around the internet. There was a guy, it was on video just 3 weeks ago, about a guy who luckily had the cameras on when a white cop put crack in his business. Did you see that?
I heard about that. No, I didn't see the video, though.
There's a video where the white cop puts crack on the counter of this man's store and then have him arrested, where he was able to get the evidence, and he got off, and the guy, I don't know what happened to the cop. But the bottom line is that in this society, black men are guilty until proven guilty. So if I'm walking down the street and a cop says I look however I look, and he kills me, he can make up any kind of story he wants to. And there's going to be people, black and white, who are going to believe it. There are black people who believe that what happened to Michael Brown is what he deserved. Right,
and that's one of the major problems I have with how the whole grand jury was laid out. When you go through all of the documentation, it's as though Darren Wilson was never challenged, and his word was bond. It's totally incredible, and the fact that this is another issue, that the police are given so much freedom and leeway. It's dangerous, and no one is really discussing, as you put it out earlier, the racial dynamic of that. We have a book, I mentioned it earlier, what Norm Stamper wrote. No one's discussing that racial dynamic, but it's amazing that Darren Wilson is able to slip in code words: demon, big man, I felt like a little 5-year-old when he grabbed me. Little words like that, and there's no analysis of that.
Yeah, and also that tendency to not look at what you just mentioned and the racial and racist component here. Obama is basically talking in ways that's keeping that kind of crap going.
Yeah, I wanted to save that actually for the next segment, but you bring it up. Can we save that for the next segment? And because there's a few other things I want to discuss as we get into the Obama stuff. But there's one thing here that happened the day before the grand jury verdict came down. I don't know if you heard it, but former New York City Mayor Rudolph Giuliani and Professor Michael Eric Dyson had a very interesting exchange.
I find it very disappointing that you're not discussing the fact that 93% of blacks in America are killed by other blacks. We're talking about the exception here.
Well, look, first of all, go ahead, Michael. No, but this is about a trust issue.
We are talking about the significant exception. 93% of blacks are killed by other blacks.
Let me respond to that.
I would like to see the attention. I'd like to see the attention paid to that you are paying to this, and the solutions to that.
He's taking up time. Can I say this? First of all, most black people who commit crimes against other black people go to jail. Number two, they are not sworn by the police department as a agent of the state to uphold the law. So in both cases, that's a false equivalency that the mayor has drawn, which is exacerbated tensions that are deeply embedded in American culture. Black people who kill black people go to jail. Black people who kill black people go to jail. White people who are policemen who kill black people do not go to jail. If a jury can indict a ham sandwich, why is it taking so long?
Mr. Mayor, let me ask you, it's the trust issue, though. This is a trust issue.
It's hardly insignificant.
I didn't say it was insignificant. I said it was out of proportion in your false equivalency, sir.
It is the reason for the heavy police presence in the black community.
Not at all. Not at all.
93%.
The police presence cannot make a distinction between those who are criminals and those who call the police to stop the criminals.
What about the poor black child that is killed by another black child? Why aren't you protesting that?
Those people go to jail. I do protest it. I'm a minister. They go to jail. Why don't you talk about the way in which white policemen have undercut the ability of Americans to live?
So why don't you cut it down so many white police officers don't have to be in black areas?
They don't have to be. It's a matter of the effect of the state occupying those forces, sir.
How about 70 to 75% of the crime in my
your attitude reinforces the problematic perspective that prevails in the culture. So
how about you reduce crime?
This is a debate. When I become mayor, I'll do that.
Feisty exchange between Rudolph Giuliani and Michael Eric Dyson. Cleo, what were your thoughts on that whole discourse? And it's not an unusual discussion. We've heard about the black-on-black crime issue for quite some time. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I know we're going to be talking about Obama later, but again, this is an issue of a white person excluding the context of why things occur. And that's what a lot of racist white people do when they talk about black dysfunctional behavior or so-called violent behavior. They try to imply all the time that it's some kind of genetic disposition and just the way black folks are. There was an actor, I forgot his name now, who played in this show on HBO called Treme or something, who talked about how we learn from the best, meaning black people learn from white people over time in this country, how to be brutal, how to be violent, how to be destructive to another human being.
But you have to realize that, yes, the involvement of violence in black folks comes from that long history that the president was talking about, that we have to remember that we learned from some of the best. They had some white boys came over here that did the first beheadings in Point Coupee, Louisiana, where I'm from. Slave insurrection, that was the way you dealt with it. Tuskegee syphilis incident. We're going to see how black men die if they have syphilis, but we pretend we treat them with penicillin, and we're just going to watch the pathology of how they die. Now, that wasn't back 200 years ago. That was 1930 to 1974. We're talking about giving these wonderful blankets to the Native Americans infected with smallpox as they walked on that trail of tears just to see how they die and to eliminate their population so we can take all of that land. So the violence that is in America has come from a very learned position that was brought here by some Caucasian folks. All right? So now...
And that's the context. Even whipping, as we talked before in terms of the football player, all of this stuff comes out of the context of what we were introduced to living in this country and our lives being ran by evil people. So this evil person now is Giuliani, who's always been racist and always had this superior white supremacist type of attitude. And apparently the minister was trying to counter that But these people cannot handle the context, because the context makes them look bad, and it wouldn't be as easy for them to victimize black people if they had context. One of the things that the minister said was that white people commit crimes toward each other too. Well, they do, and it's almost at a rate of 90% of the crime that they experience comes from other whites. So there's not a bunch of white folks who are dealing with having a police mobs in their community.
Right.
So, there's an imbalance here that's based on racism.
Right. The actor you were referencing there early on is Wendell Pierce. He was in the HBO series Treme, based on New Orleans.
Yes.
And the football player is Adrian Peterson. We all know about the child abuse issues that he faced for quite some time. Question, though, as we wrap up this segment, why is that argument still going on? Because there are black people who talk about black on black crime and don't view the other statistics, because white on white crime is about 85%. And why is black on black crime stigmatized in such a way? Well,
the context of all this is occurring in, and when it comes to black people, is we don't know our history. We have no idea about what we've been through, what we've accomplished, what being a warrior and a resistor to racism looks like. We don't know. So in a reality that's only partly informed, black people buy into the black on black stigmatizing mythology as well. So you got black people buying into it. You got white people reinforcing it because it keeps them in power. And that's what's going on here. People are keeping these ideas going because they have a vested interest. A lot of black people have a vested interest in white approval, and a lot of white people have a vested interest in keeping the mythology of their superiority going, so things can stay as they are, which means that black people will always be victimized under these circumstances.
Mm-hmm. Okay. The much hyped and much awaited Obama segment's coming up. You're listening to the Parallel Realities Podcast.
I tried to make that short so that Lynn Sweet would get her last question in.
Thank you, Mr. President. Recently, Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. was arrested at his home in Cambridge. What does that incident say to you, and what does it say about race relations in America?
Well, I should say at the outset that Skip Gates is a friend, so I may be a little biased here. I don't know all the facts. What's been reported, though, is that the guy forgot his keys, jimmied his way to get into the house. There was a report called into the police station that there might be a burglary taking place. So far, so good. The police are doing what they should. There's a call. They go investigate what happens. My understanding is, at that point, Professor Gates is already in his house. The police officer comes in. I'm sure there's some exchange of words, but my understanding is that Professor Gates then shows his ID to show that this is his house. And at that point, he gets arrested for disorderly conduct, charges which are later dropped. Now, I don't know, not having been there and not seeing all the facts, what role race played in that, but I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home. And number three, what I think we know separate and apart from this incident is that there is a long history in this country of African Americans and Latinos being stopped by law enforcement disproportionately. And that's just a fact.
Comments in context from President Barack Obama from July 2009. Now, just to set this up in some clarity, remember that was back in July 2009, not more than 6 months after the president was in office. And longly held in the black community has been police brutality, rather. That's been a key issue within the black community. And I think many people were either buoyed or inspired or happy to hear the president address that in the way that he did when his friend Henry Louis Gates was confronted by a police officer in a disrespectful manner. There was excitement and pleasure in the black community as a result of that. Unfortunately, what preceded President Obama's comments was pretty much a smackdown from the Fraternal Order of the Police. It turned into a trivialized or less than powerful beer summit between President Obama, his friend Henry Louis Gates, and the officer in question. So as a result of that, I think that a lot of black people kind of distanced themselves from Obama in terms of him really being for them. Cleo, do you think there's any possibility or any truth in that, or am I just kind of off base? Because I think that's important as we look at what's been happening and where we are now.
I have a potentially complex perspective of this. I think you know, I've been invited to the White House 3 times. And each time that I was invited to the White House, it wasn't just me, it was me as part of a group. And I was invited as an expert within the group on black health-related issues. And what was fascinating about these invitations is that I was being asked to come to the White House on behalf of discussing black issues, which is unprecedented. That didn't happen much during any other presidency. So I think that in his way, Obama has tried to do something for black people, but I think he has split allegiances. I think he has allegiance to white folks. Maybe that's a residue of having allegiance to his mother. You know, we all love our mother. He has allegiance to white folks. He speaks in ways that don't talk about racism and how virulent it is in direct, clear ways. He's always talking about it in some kind of fast food, infomercial style. And the way he talks about racism, he sounds like a white man. His comments that he made today about people rioting in Ferguson and how there are real issues driving what's going on here, but if people act out, they'll be criminalized. Well, he never ever articulates what those real issues or those hard issues are that are driving this. So he speaks in these abstract, ambiguous ways. That is how a lot of white people talk about racist issues. They don't want to be they don't want to tell on themselves, so they tell an abstract story. Right. And that's why I say that Obama's like a white man, because his story is always abstract too, except for the criminal part. You are doing criminal things if you tear up something in your community, and you'll pay the consequences for that.
Well, we had this discussion last week. What's wrong or what's different or unfair about someone behaving in a criminal way? I mean, you know, what's wrong about that, and why should there be context provided for that?
Well, in this instance, and this is, I'll attempt to be short here, but the anger and rage happened in response to what should be criminal, which is the murder of somebody unarmed. So the people who are going off feel like they were the witness of a criminal act, and not only were they a witness of a criminal act, they're at risk to be victims of that criminal act themselves. So when they started acting out and burning things down, they don't consider themselves being criminals. They consider themselves taking it upon themselves to make sure there's some kind of punishment or response to the lack of a justice response to a criminal act of murder.
Okay.
So in Obama's case, when he says this cold word, well, there's hard issues. If he would say, as President of the United States, that these people are responding to a history of racism and a history of mistreatment based on being black, and that's why they're doing it, and I understand, though I don't tolerate the burning of buildings, that would give a message that black kids would consider and take to heart.
Well, here's another thing, and this is a race relations theory that I have, and bear with me. Not too long, I remember back in the early 90s, David Dinkins was the mayor of New York City, became the first black mayor in New York City history. One time I was on the train coming home in the evening, and some would consider a bum was on the train, a black man, and there was a white man in a business suit. Somehow they got into some type of what happened was the man who would be considered a bum was very happy about the fact that Dinkins was the mayor. He was like, Dinkins the mayor. He was like, yeah, black people. He was really proudly expressing that. It was just me, him, and the white guy on the train. And the guy was just talking. And the white guy seemed to be bothered by that. He made comments and he referenced it, and they got into an argument. Long story short, and the point I'm trying to make here is that I think all of what's kind of happening now is the result of having a black president in the United States of America. These things come to head, perhaps certainly not by coincidence, but they come to head, and I think they need to be addressed in some way. Eric Holder attempted to address them, but he also got shot down. He was ridiculed and challenged by making those statements. And as you just said, Obama has attempted to make those challenges, but he's been shot down repeatedly. So what's the next step as these things happen? Because our leaders try to do it or do it halfway, and then they never get addressed, but then the young people are in the streets.
Well, the President of the United States and the Attorney General can say what they want to say. So this whole shot down thing is only effective if you allow yourself to succumb to it. Because people are always trying to shoot down me, but it don't work because I'm not having it. So little old me, with no power in quotes, cannot have it and rise above and continue on my course with what I believe in terms of justice for black people, regardless of that kind of attempt to shoot me down. If Eric Holder, and particularly Obama, had a focused commitment to use their brilliance to keep the issue of racism raised, they would. But I don't think Obama really has, I think Obama has some issues with black people.
What do you mean?
Well, I mean, he's always critiquing black people and basically talking at black people like a Republican. Like even at what's that school at Morehouse?
Morehouse, yeah.
He basically said, y'all need to get yourself together and put yourself by your bootstraps and be responsible, blah blah blah. And when he talked to fathers once, I remember he did something a long time ago to black fathers.
Yeah.
And he was getting on their case. And when he gets on their case and says we don't have time for excuses, there's a difference between excuses and factors.
Let me ask you a question, because you bring up two very good points. And I'm sure you and everyone remembers those the first Tuesday in November for 2008 and also really for 2012, how black people came to the polls in droves to vote for President Obama. Now, obviously, there were some people who probably never participated in the voting process before who were there to vote. I interviewed some. They were excited to be a part of this moment, and based on what little they had seen of Obama, they thought he would make a huge difference. Okay, now, fast forward to the incident that I talked about involving his friend Henry Louis Gates and some of the things you just spoke about. Do you think people who voted for the first time or who hadn't voted in a long time were disillusioned by the inactivity or the inability to stand firm and have a strong back, and as a result these people have stepped away from the process and aren't voting?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that people were excited about both Michelle Obama as well as Barack Obama. And we don't see Michelle. It's like she's not even there. Now, unless she's handing a carrot to a fat white kid or wearing some gown before she gives an award to somebody. You know, she's not present as a sister that's in the White House. I think people are very disillusioned, but we get caught up emotionally a lot. And what I mean by that is even if we are in a state of being disillusioned, part of us are still glad and excited every time we see Obama, and particularly when we see Michelle, because of the symbolic power it has in our needy minds. We want the symbolism of success or possibility. And so that unfortunate state makes us unwilling to confront Obama because we don't want to mess up our romance.
Well, you will also recall, too, and I found this terribly frustrating, that even while he was running for president the first time, there were people who were challenging him, and the Reverend Wright situation took place. There were people who were challenging him to make statements on things or to be a little clearer on racial issues or things like that. And there were people, black people, who were saying, oh, he can't do that now because he's running for the president. He got to be political. This goes back to a conversation that you and I had, I believe, 2 weeks ago, right after the elections, where we were talking about that disillusionment, and you talked about symbolism and why people don't get involved in the process. People feel that voting is an okie doke, and people aren't really going to do what they do. And I think people, for that first time in 2008, and in some way in 2012, they felt that they could really, really make a difference, and they had someone who could be in there and stand for their issues. And certainly police brutality is one of the big issues in the black community, and now there's frustration and disillusionment as a result.
Yeah, but one of the things that Obama did say, and I was excited about it in terms of the theory behind this, he said, now that I'm president, the work just begins. And I think what he meant by that was, okay, now that I'm here, y'all got to show up and advocate and do what the immigrants community, Jews and white gays have done. They're constantly showing up and advocating for their positions.
Well, aren't we
Black
showing?
people have been excited about.
Well, I'm sorry. I really don't mean to cut you off, but you talked about showing up. Well, aren't we showing up now? I mean, you look at the streets of Ferguson.
No. Showing up in the streets of Ferguson is not the same thing as understanding. For example, in Ferguson, the black community could get rid of the prosecutor next time there's an election. They can get rid of him. They can get rid of him and bring in whoever they think who's running is best. They have that power right in their hands.
You really think so? You really think so? I mean, look at the power that McCulloch. I mean, just bear with me 1 second. Look at the power McCulloch showed during that whole grand jury. He is in bed. He's clearly in bed with the police. And then the police want that because that's a very beneficial relationship. We know that votes can be stolen or lost or things like that. I mean, there are many. I mean, we interviewed a young man, barely 20 years old, who knew what happened in the Bush-Gore election. So clearly, things can kind of happen where the powers that be set things up to keep it going that way. And I wasn't just talking about Ferguson. I was talking about L.A., Boston, New York. These cities where young people are in the streets because of that. Isn't that in some way holding people accountable?
Well, let me go back to Ferguson, then I'll get more universal. Ferguson, though, is predominantly black. And if they tested the process and found that what they did wasn't working, they have blatant evidence that is corrupt, and they can go from there. Right now, they're complaining based on having experienced injustice, but they have not tested their power to actually frame the political machine in their local community. So people in Ferguson can do that. They can't do that in LA. They can do that in New York. But in Ferguson, they can do that. They can test a system where they're the majority and see what happens. Now, getting back to your question about whether what they're doing is holding people accountable, not yet. Now, it might get to that, but not yet, because they have not given a position except for we're angry that Darren Wilson was not indicted. That's their only message. They have not called out any names, including the president's name, on a national basis and said, look, you are who it's your fault that this is going down. And so you cannot have the kind of change that they need without a specific goal beyond venting.
Let me ask you this.
And right now they're venting.
Okay. Well, you think there's fear in saying that to President Obama? Because, again, I gave the example of when he was running for president for the first time, people wanted to hold him accountable, but there were also this segment of people saying, oh, no, he can't. He needs to be a politician. He can't deal with that right now. Reverend Wright issue is holding him back. Reverend Wright should be quiet right now. Let him get into office first. So you think there's fear in some way, people to challenge the president so directly?
I think it's not just fear. I think that it's the unknown. Before Barack Obama became the first person with African descent to be in the president's seat, it was completely and historically and culturally and psychologically and emotionally and every kind of way you can think of it, an unknown. It never happened before. So we had to put our minds around it. And it became sacred, so sacred, we didn't want to challenge it and mess it up for the president and challenge him. Because that's how black people do in this society, given the uniquely horrific experience that we had in this country historically. So the issue is not just fear. The issue is protecting of Obama. He's being protected because he's a black male, ironically, and he's the president. Now it's dysfunctional. There's rumors that you may have heard about how black women raise their daughters and baby their sons. You've heard that before, right?
Sure, Jawansa Kunjufu, yes.
And that might be what's going on with Barack Obama. He's being babied.
Interesting. Okay. Well, one last thing here, and you're right. Fear wasn't the right word. Allegiance, I guess, is the more direct term to use.
Empty allegiance.
Well, there's an allegiance that people feel based on what you talked about, the horrific relationship that we've had and that we've experienced. Last thing on this segment, though, what do you want to see from him? I know you mentioned that you want more of a stronger stance. Okay, if he takes he's catching hell in so many ways with whatever he does. If he makes those statements that you want, what would be his reaction or counter to those who are like, no, you've heard the phrases, you've stepped out of your bounds. Who does he think he is? Blah blah blah. Because again, there needs to be some sort of counter to that as he moves forward. And I do think people will stand with him. But what could be a counter to that as he moves along?
If I understand your question, and again, all we can do is hypothesize because what I'm going to say doesn't exist. And it has not happened yet. But if Obama came out against racism, it would be very powerful. He would have tons of support, even from people among the liberal community and most black people and other people of color, so-called, if he came out against racism. But as I'm told Dr. Welsing said today on a radio show, and I've said it before, and I think Obama demonstrated this during his debate with Romney, we have an uncontrolled fear of white folks and whiteness, and are intimidated by the power that they have galvanized through their techniques and strategies, all which have been brutal and sociopathic. And I think that Obama is not immune to being afraid of white folks, almost to the point of an irrational fear, because what the youth are out there raising hell about is a legitimate and absolutely real issue. Even if you take Darrell Wilson out of the picture, there are all kinds of examples of brutality and instances of unarmed black people winding up dead. So there's a legitimate position that shouldn't happen. But even when you have a legitimate position, if you're scared of white folks, you can't stand behind it. And I think that going back to the Romney Barack Obama debate that he had to get his second tenure as president, he's scared too.
You're listening to the Parallel Realities Podcast. Welcome back to the Parallel Realities Podcast. Pharrell Williams made news recently. The Happy Man made some comments about the Mike Brown verdict, and he kind of referenced that he thought more attention should be paid to Mike Brown's actions in the store prior to him being killed, where the video shows Mike Brown roughing up the store clerk. And Pharrell thought that more attention should be paid to the fact that he was behaving like a bully. Interesting that those comments would be made. I'm not sure if behaving like a bully means that you should be murdered, but what were your thoughts on that, Cleo?
Well, clearly it does. I mean, that's the context. Clearly it does mean you should be murdered because that's the context. And when Pharrell Williams gives his perspective, he doesn't mention that. And like I've told others since I've heard this comment, you can't get no more bullying than shooting somebody unarmed. That's an industrial strength bully. So he's just doing the reason why we know Pharrell Williams and why he's on TV and why he has all this press is because he's a white accommodationist. And he gets on TV wherever he gets and was willing to give some kind of crazy perspective that's not particularly helpful to black people. So he's doing his job. But like I said, no one is justifying bullying. I don't justify bullying, but he's being a hypocrite because, as I've already said, killing somebody who don't have a gun and you have a gun is the ultimate bullying.
Well, I'm just working with you and discussing this with you. Here's perhaps Pharrell is thinking that karma perhaps played into this. 10 minutes ago, you're bullying someone in a store over some cigarettes. And now 10 minutes later, you are facing your repercussions, if you will.
Well, even if that's his perspective, in my opinion, it's a white supremacist perspective because if the karma was relevant, all white folks would be dead.
Why isn't there context? Why can't someone like Pharrell see the context there?
Because he comes from a generation, from my perspective, of the uninformed, of the uneducated, of the non-contextual, of black people or people who are part black, seeing crazy dysfunctional black behavior, and instead of understanding it, doing what they can to disassociate it from it. And part of having a critique of Michael Brown, where his alleged bully behavior is highlighted, is more disassociative, white accommodating behavior, which is the natural outcome of a black generation with no history. Without history, white people look like the most wonderful things on earth. With history, they're in context, and black dysfunctional behaviors in context, and we can finally create a roadmap toward resolving it all. But without a roadmap, Gerald Wilson gets off, and people like Pharrell Williams basically tries to justify it by talking this crap about, well, Michael Brown was a bully, instead of seeing Gerald Wilson as the ultimate bully, and the prosecutor, who sit there and then even do a prosecution case. That's bullying too. One of the most easiest things to find in this country is an anti-black black person. You can also find an anti-homosexual homosexual. You can also find an anti-woman female. You can find people who have internalized the larger agendas and isms in the society. So any black person of note that was willing to say what he would have said, what he did say, would have had all kinds of microphones in their face, because white people thrive on the Don Lemons and the Pharrell Williams and people like that in society because it helps keep them in control. So, they're just doing what they do. They're doing what they have always done.
Thanksgiving weekend coming up, and obviously we're kind of trained or programmed to 45 minutes after eating Thanksgiving dinner, it's time to go shopping. At least some of us are. Black Friday coming up, big shopping time supposedly here in America. In terms of economics, there are several boycotts planned throughout the black community for Black Friday. Your thoughts on that, Cleo, and do you think they can be effective?
if they actually do it, they could be very, 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 very effective. One thing that one of the things that gives black people power in theory, because we haven't put it into practice yet, is our economic capacity. And if we did do a boycott, it would have impact, major impact.
Okay, is there something that, because this has been spoken about before, doing this sort of thing? What happened? I mean, because boycotting used to be a very powerful thing. And forgive me, I keep asking you this question, what happened? But really, what happened? Because boycotting was very, very powerful back during the Civil Rights Movement. Why has boycotting become almost like a secretive word, or that only a few do, and they do it in a private sort of way?
Again, it goes back to the issue of not knowing your history. Our kids don't know nothing about no boycott. And when they hear the word, they know what it means to an extent, but they have an abstract, disoriented relationship to the phenomena. They don't know their history. They don't know. We don't know what we've done and the things that we've done to get to make some type of strides. We don't know.
Well, that's sad, because now, I mean, do we know now? I mean, you think all of a sudden we know?
No, the boycott, and there was a boycott of sorts that happened. I think it was in response to Trayvon Martin. Not everybody participated.
Well, if successful, let's just talk about that in terms of black economics. Should there be a situation where we as black people make a conscious effort to always buy black, or is it just we'll do it today and then Saturday we just jump right back into what we were doing, or Monday, the big internet website day, we do it? How does that really work, and how is that rationalized? Because honestly, there are some things you're going to need to purchase from non-black store owners. So how can someone rationalize that and still be effective?
Anything could be done with a strategy. Anything.
Well, I mean, give me if you can, just explore it with me. Because you understand what I'm saying. There are some things that you're going to have to purchase from a non-black store. So how can that be rationalized or still done within the framework of boycotting?
Well, for example, and this is off the top of my head, if there's going to be a boycott coming up, black people need to go where they can go, a place that black people benefit from to shop or whatever, and get things that they need, and then not shop at these mainstream places, nothing like that, for as long as possible as a collective. That in and of itself will show our power and that we're not playing. Also, there's some things that we keep rich that we don't need. We don't need weaves. We don't need cable. We don't need a lot of things that we use to survive. And if we stop getting weaves, for example, shoot, that'd be several trillions of dollars that somebody's not getting.
Well, it's interesting you bring that up, because you and I, we were both in Ferguson, and there was a store in Ferguson called Beauty World. Now, as a result of the rioting and looting, Beauty World wasn't burned down, but it was looted heavily, and the store owner doesn't quite know how they're going to bounce back. For context and clarity, Beauty World is a female store with wigs, and cosmetics, and things like that, Asian owned. So you're saying that we don't need weaves. We had this hair discussion before, and why? I mean, so what? People wear their hair a certain way, and they do that. I know you saw the Chris Rock movie about hair and all that stuff, and you and I both feel that he kind of copped out towards the end. But that's going to be a powerful thing to kind of change people from doing.
It's all a powerful thing to change people from doing. Black people, in my opinion, don't really like ourselves because we don't know our history, because we don't have no powerful context to create allegiance and loyalty. So we don't really like black people. So as a result of that mindset, anything we do is going to take a little work, but it still can be done. It could be done. Right. It meaning we can collectively get together and decide to boycott. Just like we're collectively getting together to some extent right now, though it's reactionary, it still shows our possibility. We're reacting to the Darrell Wilson verdict,
right.
On a national level and in local communities, predominantly black folks. So we can do things.
Right. Not to be cynical or to judge the protesters in Ferguson or any other city, and we'll leave this show on this note. I didn't see McDonald's facing any looting or broken windows or anything like that. And again, I'm not encouraging it, but if you're going to do it, it seemed like McDonald's and what they offer the community is someplace you might want to look at, or even boycott for that matter, because I've never seen McDonald's take a stand on a black human rights issue. Have you?
No, but I think there's two issues here. One is that, like many of the McDonald's happening these days, it's 24 hours, and there's people in there. If they'd have burned it down, they'd been burning up some black folks because they up in there. Number one. Number two, McDonald's is considered to be an old standby that has grown to the level of being a sacred institution in some communities, because we got to have our Big Mac. We got to have our this or whatever else. I haven't been to McDonald's in decades, but I know they got all this Mac stuff, and that people probably were getting food while they was rioting from McDonald's.
Right. Well, funny you mentioned that. A very encouraging note, because everyone talked about the looting in Ferguson after the not guilty verdict. I believe the name of the store is Kathy's Ribs in Ferguson, black owned. The people have been in husband and wife shop, have been in the community for several years, and they were fearful that their place would be looted. But as a result of their camaraderie or kinship with the community, the looters chose not to loot that store. As a matter of fact, they stood out in front and made sure that no one went in and looted. So that's a positive aspect of that, and I think that's something that may want to be considered in terms of when vendors or merchants come into communities truly representing a community, not coming in and just taking the money out, truly representing a community, because in that case, there may have been some kinship that the community felt with this particular place.
Well, I think the kinship that you're talking about is the same kinship they have with McDonald's. And what I mean by that is that those people they availed themselves to the community. And because they availed themselves to the community was not hostile toward them, and they were protected. And I think McDonald's is seen as a place that has availed itself to the community because they provide jobs, they provide low-cost food, and they have a certain glamour to them, believe it or not. I mean, when I was little, going to McDonald's was a big deal.
Right. Yeah, Happy Meals and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cleo, do you have plans for this holiday weekend?
I don't celebrate Thanksgiving, so it's not considered a holiday weekend for me. But my mama, who can't hear no from me ever, asked me to go see her, and I'm going to see her. But I won't be in no pilgrim outfit and doing those blatant Thanksgiving stuff, but I will be at her presence on that day.
Right. I won't either. I think one of the nicest things about the holiday is that it just brings family together. I think that's the most important part of it. And I think in terms of holidays, and at least the winter holidays with Thanksgiving and then Christmas coming up, Thanksgiving is the most real holiday in terms of what it kind of represents in terms of family. So by all means, enjoy that with your mother, and I will enjoy my time with my family as well. Okay?
I'll do my best, and thank you.
Thank you. You've been listening to the Parallel Realities podcast. I'm Anthony Harris with Cleo Monago. If you want to issue any comments to us, please email us at parallelrealitiespodcast@gmail.com. You can like us on Facebook and also follow us on Twitter at Parallel Real. That's at Parallel Real. And we hope to have a website up very soon. Thank you very much for listening. Everyone enjoy the holiday weekend.